Last but certainly not least, the final presentation of our 10 presentation sequence is titled Sex Work, Race, and Bias, Police Violence Against Trans People. Please join me in welcoming from the Department of Sociology, Tess McGee.
On June 28, 1969, patrons of the Stonewall Inn famously fought back against the transphobic harassment from the New York police. However, despite this historic protest and decades of resistance since, the violence hasn't stopped. 50 years later, just days after George Floyd's murder sparked international protests, Tony McDade, a black trans man, was shot and killed by police in Florida for resisting a transphobic attacker. Police violence against trans people is a long-standing, pervasive, and ongoing reality, but nothing's been done to protect those in danger, and little research has seriously investigated this violence. Trans people, or those who identify or present differently from the gender assigned to them at birth, face widespread discrimination within our society, and this forces them to engage in sex work at higher rates than the rest of the U.S. population. Because of this, many police officers just assume that any given trans person is engaged in sex work, and that, coupled with the police violence against trans sex workers specifically, forces all trans people into higher risk of police contact and violence. This is even worse for non-white trans people, as they face even more discrimination in our society, and that, coupled with police brutality and discrimination against Black, Indigenous, and other non-white people, forces them into even higher risks of experiencing this violence. So to understand the scope of this issue better, I used the 2015 United States Transgender Survey to see how sex work, race, and bias attribute to higher risks of police violence for trans people. I found that those who had interacted with the police while thought to be engaged in sex work had much higher risks of experiencing police violence than those who had just ever engaged in sex work. Now, this is especially important considering that half of those who interacted with the police while thought to be engaged in sex work had never actually engaged in sex work. Now, this means that police are making wide assumptions about trans people, trans sex workers are facing high rates of violence, but most importantly, it shows that direct police contact is a higher risk for trans people than any individual decision to engage in sex work. Furthermore, non-white trans people had more than double the rate of this violence, which points to the salience of racism in policing and in trans people's experiences with police violence. I also found that trans people who interacted with police who knew they were trans had higher rates of this violence as well. And this points to the very direct and strong role of transphobia and trans people's experiences with police violence. Transphobia is on the rise in our country, but specifically in our state of Oklahoma. And that makes this so much more important and relevant. Trans people, again, face widespread discrimination in our society, but this violence from those who claim to protect and serve is particularly dangerous. If we're truly committed to justice, the safety of trans people, particularly trans people of color, must be fought for, and this widespread abuse of power must be brought to an end.